week then. This interview is particularly pleasurable for me because I've known the interviewee for over 40 years. Nicholas and I were at school together in England, and I thought I should just get that out there as part of full disclosure. As Mark Johnston said, he's the author of two very good books, Warriors of God and Killing Mr Lebanon. And as Mark Ryan said, we wanted to mix it up a bit this week and get some non-wine people on board to give a little bit of background, to give a little bit of context to the country. But if we're being accurate, Nick does have a wine connection, because when we left school in 1983, Nick went straight into the wine trade and was rescued by journalism. Wine's loss was journalism's gain, I think, and he's been in Lebanon, I think Nick will correct me, since 95 or the end of 94.
The end of 94.
And 94, so that's 26 years he's been covering Lebanon and the Middle East. And so I think that he's an entirely appropriate candidate to have on our 7th web chat, because not only does he understand wine, but he understands war and some of the issues in which he's tackled during his 26 years in the Middle East touch on both. Nick, thanks for joining us. And I'd like to jump straight into a wine and war question. Wine is not only in the front line of conflict, or it has been in the front line of conflict in Lebanon throughout the centuries, but today the vines literally share an uneasy peace in the Becca Valley with another plant, often associated with, if not conflict, but violence and organized crime, and that's cannabis. And when Mark and I were filming in 2017, we went up to Deir al-Ahmar in the northern Bekaa, just west of Baalbek, an area I'm sure you know very well, and we encountered the owners, we met the owners of Couvent Rouge, who had just leased several hectares of land from the church. And the church was encouraging them to grow vines instead of growing cannabis. Maybe you could give us some background as to the importance and the impact and the influence of the drug trade in the Bekaa and how it sits within the social fabric of that part of the country.
Yeah, I think you have to understand initially that the Bekaa Valley is a very impoverished part of Lebanon. It's almost physically, geographically, topographically cut off from Beirut, the coastal littoral, the main cities, Tripoli, Saida, Beirut, Tyre. And of course, it's a very fertile place as well, the breadbasket of the Roman Empire and so on. So hashish cultivation, or hashish has been cultivated there for, I mean, centuries, and opium as well. So I mean, if you go to the, I think it's the Temple of Bacchus in Baalbek, and you see the great gateway at the entrance to the Temple of Bacchus with the hanging keystone. As part of the frieze going up the side of the gateway, you have opium, you have the vine leaves, and you have hashish. So these three crops have been intertwined for the millennia. So during the lawless years of the Civil War, the hashish plantations and the opium was very widely grown across the Bekaa Valley. Obviously, there was no law and order to do anything about it. When the war ended in 1990, the UNDP stepped in, and there were international pledges for money to try to switch farmers from growing hashish to licit crops. but the money never really came in. There was an eradication program to get rid of the hashish. The opium has essentially gone now. I think very, very little opium has actually grown in the Bekaa. But because the international, the pledged funds didn't really arrive in the 90s, you started to see hashish cultivation coming back again. So now if you drive, I mean, the farmers will say that they love it when there's instability in Lebanon, whether it's a war like in 2006 with Israel, whether it was a battle in the Palestinian camp in 2007, Lebanese army against a jihadist group up there. It kind of sidetracks the security forces from going after the hashish farmers. And normally they would come in late summer, early autumn with their bulldozers to destroy all the crops just ahead of the harvest. And there'd be sort of gun battles and so on and so forth. Now, of course, the latest development, I guess, is that the parliament, the Lebanese parliament has agreed to cultivate legal hashish for medicinal use, and this is still very early stages. I think the farmers that I talk to are rather skeptical about how this is going to work, whether they'll actually make any money out of it. But this is one way that the government, a cash-strapped government, more now than ever before, has been looking at ways of trying to, to turn a hashish into a illicit and lucrative crop to try and improve the economic plight of the Bekaa and bring a few shekels into the government coffers.
How would quote legalizing unquote the cannabis production? How would that stand with the people who control the drug trade? And while you answer that, who controls the drug trade in the Bekaa?
The drug trade is controlled by individuals. There is no one overarching controlling enterprise. It's done on a very sort of local basis. So you'll have your hardscrabble farmer who will have a couple of dunams of hashish, and he will sell that to a middleman who will be buying up from all the hardscrabble farmers in the area. And then it could get sold on again to one of the big drug barons, and you see their rather ostentatious villas dotted around parts of the Bekaa Valley. And these are the guys that export it. A lot of it gets exported, or did, through Syria down to Jordan, into the Gulf. In times past, it was going off to Europe, to the United States as well, not so much these days, of course. And it's the guys sitting at the top of the pyramid that really make the money. The farmers don't actually make a great deal of money from this. So it's very localized. There's not one kind of controlling mafia over the whole thing.
And would the state be paying the same rate that they get now for the kilo or the ton, or I don't know how much what it's sold by?
It's sold by the hotta, which is roughly a kilo. Well, that's the big question, of course. And the farmers are understandably very skeptical that they would be paid the same that they get on the black market. But a lot of it's down to the monitoring. They were talking about allocating a certain number of plants to the farmer, and then there would be a constant monitoring process of government inspectors making sure that those same plants are in the allotted space, literally counting them, 1, 2, 3, all the plants, to make sure that the farmer hasn't, taken, say, 20% of the plants, gone round to the backyard, and he's planting it for the black market. I think being able to monitor all this and to keep it 100% licit and legal is going to be very difficult.
So I've often thought that the idyllic situation, or the ideal situation, would be to turn the Bekaa into one big greenhouse for wine and weed. You'd have a certain parts of the Bekaa could be developed with vines. I mean, Lebanon only makes 10 million bottles a year, which is microscopic in a global market of 36 billion bottles. So even if we tripled our production, we'd still be tiny at 30 million. And then the other part of the Bekaa could be used for medicinal cannabis, all regulated and legal. How would that sit with the farmers of the Bekaa, do you think? And how would it sit with the people who give them political cover, which presumably, in a large part, is Hezbollah?
Hezbollah gives limited amounts of cover to some of the drug people. I mean, I know there is a lot of speculation that Hezbollah is kind of running the hashish business in the Bekaa. I've never come across any evidence of that. I think it's pretty small scale for Hezbollah. Now, Hezbollah are involved in the narco trafficking. There's plenty of reporting on an international level, South America, all that kind of thing. Individuals have been connected with synthetic drug manufacture, Captagon, this kind of thing, amphetamine type of drugs. But I've never really seen any kind of Hezbollah control over the hashish cultivation. This is more down to the farmers, going to the middlemen, going to the larger drug barons who then export it. There may well be cuts involved going to local Hezbollah people, but I've never really seen any hard evidence of that. The only evidence I've seen of Hezbollah involvement in the hashish business is related to Israel. And between 2000 and 2006, Hezbollah was co-opting some of the drug dealers in South Lebanon, using them essentially as a vehicle to get intelligence out of Israel. So the way it worked was your drug dealer in South Lebanon would throw his packets of hashish literally over the fence to Israeli accomplices on the other side. The Israelis would throw back cash for the drug dealer, but also intelligence information. It could be photographs of military bases along the border, it could be maps, this kind of thing, and that will go to Hezbollah. So they had quite a little cozy relationship. That may still continue today, but probably on a smaller scale. So yeah, I mean, it's, I think Hezbollah has always had a problem with the Bekaa, because the Bekaa, it's got the reputation of being the barracks of Hezbollah. This is where Hezbollah first emerged in 82 and 83 in the little dusty hill villages of the eastern Bekaa, before their influence moved to Beirut, then gradually in the 80s moved further south. But it's a very tribal area. It's not like the southern suburbs of Beirut or South Lebanon, which are the other two main Hezbollah sort of concentrated areas. In the Bekaa, the tribe comes first. And there's been a lot of friction over the years, and including today, between the tribes and Hezbollah has to treat the tribes with kid gloves to keep them on board, to keep that recruiting flow up and running. So they tend to turn a blind eye to, I mean...
Guys, I forgot to tell you before we started that Nick told me that at some point the electricity might be cut in his building, such as life in Lebanon. And I think that's what's happened now. And he told me when that happens, he'll just have to run downstairs, flick a switch, and the power will come back. So if you can bear with us for a second, we'll wait until he's back. In the meantime, does anyone have any questions that they would like me to ask?
Yeah, Michael, you started the conversation asking about some churches that it sounded like might be growing hashish in the Bekaa. Do they have parcels of weed out there, the church?
No, I think what I said was that the church, which is one of the biggest landowners in Lebanon, had approached the Der Ahmar winery, and they were happy for them to lease their land and grow grapes, because the church wanted to see more grapes being grown in the Bekaa rather than the hectares of cannabis fields that we saw.
Got it.
Michael, about growing grapes and vineyards in the Bekaa and wineries, is there any sort of ethical, any fundamentalists that oppose the production of wine or grapes in the Bekaa?
Yeah, I think, this is the perennial question that's asked. I think that there are, of course, elements within the Islamic religious community in Lebanon that sees anything related to alcohol as what the Arabs would call haram. But Lebanon being Lebanon, never come between a Lebanese and his cash. And I think that if the farmer is growing grapes and then sells the grapes on then I think that's a fairly clear loophole that he's not actually getting involved in the alcohol industry. You know, the argument being, well, what I do, what the person I sell the grapes to does with it is not my concern. And so I think that there is that there's that, and the fact that nobody wants to come between a Lebanese and his economic livelihood. So as long as all the boxes are ticked, then I think everyone's happy.
Mm.
To that respect, maybe it's then kind of what Nick was talking about, how the weed is only becoming legal now because it's a possible cash flow, strictly about the money.
Yeah, I think so. I will ask him when he comes back at what was the tipping point, why the government suddenly, because this is an idea that's been floated for several years now, ever since well, you guys in California started, you know, the idea of medicinal cannabis in the treatment of certain illnesses such as cancer has gained traction. Then you know, it didn't take long for the Lebanese, who they never take long to cotton on to any money making scheme, for them to start discussing this. And Walid Jumblat proposed this back in 2013. So why has it taken six to 7 years for the idea to gain traction, especially when there's a lot of opportunities for kickbacks to be made? So we will ask Nick when he comes back.
Yeah. One question I have, Michael, is the thing that actually fascinates me more than the cannabis was the opium production, which was back in the 80s and during the war much more significant. It was much more of a profit than cannabis is to grow poppies, and that I think Hezbollah had some influence in, didn't they? I mean, that's what I kind of remember from reading way back when.
Well, the short answer to that is I don't know.
Oh.
Maybe Nick will. Maybe Nick will shed some light. He's probably halfway up the stairs now.
And that's the fun about living here. You never know when the power goes out.
Well, he did warn me. He did warn me this morning that this could happen. And when his picture froze, I looked at my watch, and it was exactly 15:15. So clearly in his building, that's when the power goes.
Power goes.
Michael, has Walid Jumblat gone into retirement?
I don't know. I don't know. But I know that he keeps a very keen eye on Chateau Kifraya, of which he is officially the majority shareholder, and has been for the last couple of years.
But he's not a wine drinker.
No.
All too well.
No, Norbert and I went to have lunch with him in 2004, and while he was serving his own wine, he was correct me, Norbert, if I'm wrong, but he was on the Egyptian beer, I think.
No, he didn't believe it was Egyptian beer. It was Saqqara beer, and it just had opened. It just came into it. Just the brewery had just opened in Egypt. I was so surprised to see that he had a bottle of Egyptian beer in the middle of the Shuf Mountains, and he didn't believe me. And they said, "Produit d'Egypte." He started going, "Where the hell did this come from?" So no, he's a much more of he likes spirits, vodka, and beer.
Yeah, I hear that during the time when there was about a 2-year period and he was under serious threat of assassination, and he was holed up in Mukhtara, he was on the beer and vodka chaser. That was his poison every evening while reading the New York Review of Books.
Mike, just to let you know, I'm back after my brief absence.
Hey, mate, you're back. Yes.
Yeah.
we were talking about, in your absence, someone asked, why now? And I think you lightly touched on this. Why now is the Lebanese government suddenly taking seriously the idea of regulating the cannabis production? Because if you remember, I think in 2013 or even 2012, our friend Mr. Jumblat proposed it, and it wasn't taken seriously then. What's changed?
The government's got no money.
Right.
And so they're looking at every possibility of trying to get some cash together. And this was one that seemed to be reasonably viable. You've had a number of MPs pushing for it in the Becca because they realized that this could be a way of decreasing criminality through hashish cultivation and turn it to the good, so that, you know, the locals can earn some cash and the government can get some dividends from it as well.
Norbert had a question that I couldn't answer, and maybe you could. Apparently the opium trade in the 80s during the war was a lot more lucrative than the cannabis trade. Why has that died out?
That was the first one to go. I think partly because of the eradication process in the early 90s. Remember, the Syrians were in control of the Becca at the time. And there was a sense that because of the drug problems in the United States, in the West in general, and Europe, that this was the first one to crack down on. It was a much smaller scale than the hashish cultivation. There was a guy I used to know, quite a character, used to wear a dish dash, lives in a big tent, Bedou style, on the outskirts of a village in the Becca, and he was the only Lebanese that made the drug kingpin list in the Treasury Department. And in the 80s, this guy was just growing hashish and opium all over the place. He had ties with the Italian mafia, the gangsters in New York. They used to come and visit him. He's a very humble, wizened, basically peasant farmer. And one group actually gave him a Porsche as a present, and he destroyed it within 3 weeks, driving it up and down the tracks to go and visit his opium. But all that ended after the war. And there's talk there's a little bit of opium still grown, but now I think it's more processing. I believe that opium from Turkey and Afghanistan sometimes makes its way into the Bekaa Valley where it gets processed. But I don't think opium has really grown in any serious way here anymore.
So keeping up the tradition of the Lebanese service industry, then.
Absolutely.
In a way. You know, we touched on Hezbollah, and I know there are quite a significant tranche of people from abroad following this interview on Facebook. Now, the common perception of Hezbollah is that it is a, quote, terrorist organization, and that I'm sure to people who don't really give much thought to the Middle East as you or I do, that they probably lump Hezbollah in with the likes of Taliban and Al-Qaeda and more recently Islamic State. But it's not quite that simple, is it? How would you describe Hezbollah to someone unfamiliar with the Arab world and its role and position within Lebanese society?
Hezbollah is fundamentally a jihadist group that follows the Wali al-Faqih, which is the system of Islamic rule observed in Iran. So for Hezbollah, the ultimate boss is the Wali al-Faqih, currently embodied by Ayatollah Khamenei. It is an organization that emerged in the wake of the Israeli invasion of 1982. It had its genesis much earlier in the Hawza of Najaf in southern Iraq, where this kind of, in the 60s, you have people like Mohammed Hussein Fadlallah and others who are espousing a kind of a more militant form of Shi'ism to break away from the leftist communist tendencies of socialism that had swept the Arab world in the 50s and 60s. I mean, today, Hezbollah is essentially the most powerful military and political force in Lebanon. It says that its raison d'etre is the continued struggle against Israel. Ideologically, they want to see Israel finished and Palestine restored to the Palestinians. It very much follows the Iranian orders. We've seen, I think, over the years, over the last 30 years, a kind of an evolution of Hezbollah in the sense that in the 90s, this was very much a resistance organization battling on a daily basis the Israeli occupation in South Lebanon, and essentially won the plaudits and respect of a broad swathe of Lebanese society for their martial feats, which culminated, of course, in May 2000 when the Israelis left. Life became a bit more complicated after that because there were Lebanese saying, you did a great job, guys, but really you should hang up your weapons now. The Israelis have gone. And Hezbollah was able to say, well, look, the Sheba farms still occupied by the Israelis. The Israelis are still holding some of our detainees. Most importantly, of course, the Syrians were still calling the shots in Lebanon. And the Syrians wanted to keep Hezbollah as an armed force to needle Israel in the on-off peace negotiations between the Syrians and the Israelis. Then, of course, after the Hariri assassination in 2005, the Syrians departed and Hezbollah lost that kind of protective fig leaf. So this is when they took a deeper step into the political morass here and joined the government of Fouad Seniora in the summer of 2005. For the first time, they joined the government. They had a small parliamentary presence during the 1990s, but this was an extra step into politics. And the reason for that was by participating deeper in politics, they could better defend what they call their resistance priority, which is keeping their weapons. And, you know, we're all familiar with the story. We have the polarization between these two parliamentary blocs, one supported by the West, the other supported by Iran and Syria. We had the 2006 war. We had Hezbollah's takeover of West Beirut in 2008. Country today is completely polarized between those that support Hezbollah and support Hezbollah's resistance agenda, and other Lebanese that believe that Hezbollah is dragging the country headlong into disaster. Interestingly, in the last decades, almost a decade, we've seen Hezbollah expand from its traditional front with Israel and has become a regional military force now. So obviously they fought very successfully and visibly in Syria, but they've also fought in Iraq as part of the anti-Daesh coalition. They're in Yemen, mainly as trainers, advisors, and so on. So they've really become a kind of a regional military powerhouse and the greatest enabler for Iranian power projection across the Middle East. And that might sit well with Hezbollah supporters, but of course it doesn't sit well with those Lebanese that would much prefer to see Hezbollah put down its weapons and become a political party.
So I mean, the picture you've painted is of an organization that is very much in the forefront of Lebanese society. I mean, although Hassan Nasrallah, the party's leader, has not been seen in public or whose address is known to anyone, these are not cave dwellers. I mean, these are very much, they're in the government, they're in parliament, and they're very much part of Lebanese society. How, now that Lebanon is reaching another crossroads, and that people are putting a lot of the blame for Lebanon's current woes at the doorstep of the political class, which, as you say, since 2005 has included Hezbollah more and more. Where do you see the future for the party and the country?
Well, for the party, I think, you know, I use the analogy that Hezbollah is walking down a corridor that's getting ever narrower. In other words, their options for maneuver are getting more and more restrained the bigger and bigger they get. You have to remember, when I started covering these guys in the mid-90s, this was an organization of maybe 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 fighters, both full-time and part-time. Their longest range rocket back then could travel 12 miles, unguided, just enough to cross the then Israeli occupation zone and pepper Israeli settlements in northern Western Galilee. You compare them, the Hezbollah of the mid-90s to the Hezbollah of 2020, you have an organization that has maybe 30,000 full-time, part-time fighters, could call upon another 20, 30,000 reservists. They have an arsenal that the Israelis estimated between 130, 150,000 rockets and missiles. which is larger than most European armies. They have accurate systems now, firing 1,100-pound warheads to a target at a range of 300 kilometers and bring it within 10 to 20 meters of the target. So it's a very formidable force. But I think the difficulty Hezbollah is facing is that it's becoming harder and harder to reconcile its obedience to the Wali al-Faqih, to the Iranian leader, and its obligations to its domestic audience in the Shia community. And if you go back to the 1990s, the two marched in tandem. The Shia, many of whom lived under Israeli occupation, were 100% supportive of what Hezbollah was doing and kicking the Israelis out. But now you'll have Shia wondering why, okay, we can understand why Hezbollah was fighting in Syria. The Nasrallah used to say that we have to fight the Takfiris, the Sunni jihadists in Syria, otherwise we're going to be fighting them in Lebanon. Okay, you either subscribe to that or you don't. A lot of supporters did. The Iraq intervention, again, was justifiable in the sense that it was part of the anti-Daesh coalition. But there is a reason why Hezbollah hasn't come out and admitted fully that they're involved in Yemen, because there's no earthly Lebanon-centric reason for Hezbollah to be in Yemen, helping the Houthis of Yemen fight the Saudis and the UAE, who traditionally are supposed to be allies and friends of Lebanon. So this is becoming a very difficult paradox for Hezbollah to balance these obligations and obedience. And I don't see that getting any easier down the road, especially with the situation the country is going through at the moment. And I mean, I think, frankly, I think the situation is extremely grim in Lebanon. And I'm not sure that the Lebanese government, current Lebanese government, has the wherewithal to, or the latitude, the political latitude and strength to push back against the traditional political elite and to bring in the structural reforms, which are absolutely critical if the IMF and the international community is going to step in with some kind of financial package to get Lebanon out of this mess.
Okay, I was reading. Well, no, so someone sent me part of Robert Fisk's article recently, which was published in the UK Independent newspaper. Fisk predicted that there may be conflict in Lebanon as part of Israel's bid to neutralize Iran's nuclear ambitions, and as part of that, they'd also be taking out Iran's assets in Lebanon, who are Hezbollah. I'm a winemaker in the Becca. How scared should I be of a conflict, and what would be the implications of a war? Bearing in mind the Israelis are not going to try and do it on the cheap as they tried to do in 2006.
Well, I think that both sides, both Hezbollah and Israel, have known since August the 14th, 2006, when the ceasefire kicked in and ended that conflict, that there's going to be another one at some point. Both sides have been preparing for it. But both sides also know that the scale of the next conflict is going to completely dwarf 2006. In 2006, the geography, the battle space, if you like, the theater, was largely defined by the range of Hezbollah's rockets and missiles, which were much smaller and shorter range than what they have now. So essentially that conflict was confined to South Lebanon, northern Israel. But in the next war, it's going to run from Hermel in the northern Becca all the way down to Eilat in southern Israel. This is going to be the battle space. And because both sides are acutely aware of the scale of the level of destruction that is going to occur in both countries, I mean, Israel is going to be hit like nothing they've seen since 1948 in the next war. And this is a very sort of sobering, it's very sobering for Israeli governments and for Hezbollah as well. So there's been this kind of balance of terror, if you like, which has helped keep the peace. And Hezbollah, in fact, there's only staged 7 operations against the Israelis since 2006. That's it, public overt operations. So, I think the it's going to be very difficult for the Israelis to launch a preemptive strike against Hezbollah that's going to inflict massive damage on the Israeli home front. Israel is going to be in lockdown for the duration of the next war. Nobody's going to be able to go to work. There's no schools, universities. The seaports and airports will be blockaded by the range of Hezbollah's missiles. So, no tourists, no shipping coming into the ports. And that's going to be the case for the duration of the conflict. And the Lebanese are used to suffering. The old adage in the old days, in the 90s, when the Katyusha rockets from Hezbollah were crossing into Israel and the Israeli airstrikes and artillery coming back the other way, the Israelis will be under orders by the Israeli government to get into bunkers. And the southerners, in the hard-scrabble villages of South Lebanon, all they do is close the front door and light another cigarette and wait for it to be over. I think, personally, I think there's going to be another conflict. When? That's the big question. On July the 11th, 2006, if somebody has said, do you think we're going to have a month-long war beginning tomorrow? I would have said, I have no idea. So we could have a conflict beginning tomorrow out of a miscalculation, an accident from a tactical event that spirals out of control, or it could be another 10 years before something kicks off.
Yeah, I mean, I'm of the opinion like you that every time someone's predicted something, it hasn't happened. And when these conflicts happen out of the blue, as you say. What's the oddest experience you've had in your 26 years in Lebanon?
You put me on the spot there. Oddest experience? Actually, one of the odd experiences happened a few months ago, and I'm not going to talk about it in public. Save that for a book, maybe. But no, I mean, I think, I don't know about odd, but memorable experiences would certainly be covering the 2006 war. There was a bizarre little story I covered in June 2013 when there was this Salafi cleric called Sheikh Ahmad Asir, who was a bit of a firebrand anti-Hezbollah cleric that was whipping up the Sunni sentiment in Saida and elsewhere. And it ended up turning into a 2-day gun battle with the Lebanese army and Asir. And I went down with an American colleague and my Lebanese colleague to Saida, and we couldn't get close to the action. So I figured out the day before that if we couldn't go up to Abra, which is on the eastern outskirts of Saida, on top of the hill, we were coming up from the city and trying to head up east, up the hill. We couldn't do it. It was too much shooting going on. So I figured, why don't we loop around the back, hit the Jazin road, drive into Abra from the east. Maybe we can get closer that way. So we did that, long drive round, and we parked up the car. We started walking down the road. There's nobody around us. And then we saw Abra in front of us, the smoke and shell fire and shooting and so on. And then we heard voices from behind bushes saying, get off the road, there are snipers. Yeah, come. So we pushed through the bushes. And I don't know who was more astonished, us two foreign journalists staring at a whole bunch of Hezbollah guys armed to the teeth, or the Hezbollah guys realizing they'd just invited two foreign journalists into their midst. But because it was a dangerous situation, that they let us stay grudgingly. And we spent about 3 or 4 hours with these guys. And at one point, they drove us down to their central command post. We met their commander, who was an absolutely charming chap, and was very open about the fact that, today we are cutting out a cancerous gland from cider. And I've never seen so many armed Hezbollah fighters in one place at one time. They were going in SUV convoys into the Abra and fighting, coming back, rotating around, and more would go in. So anyway, my American colleague and I, we had a bit of a scoop because we're the only 2 journalists, and Saida was full of journalists covering all this, but we're the only 2 that had come from that side of the city and seen all these Hezbollah guys running around. So the next day when we had our articles were published, there was a lot of skepticism on social media. How come these 2 journalists are the only ones that saw Hezbollah guys fighting when everyone else just saw the Lebanese army? The Minister of Defense at the time threatened to take to court any journalists that claimed that Hezbollah was there. But gradually it became clearer and clearer that there were a lot of witnesses, locals who've seen all the Hezbollah people there, and the whole fuss died down. But it was one of those days where you go off expecting to have a fairly routine story and you come away with something quite special. That was a nice one.
And just to put that in context, the Hezbollah fighters were there in support of the army fighting who they saw were Sunni radicals inside them.
Well, I think the Hezbollah were basically doing their own thing. I mean, one of them rather disparagingly told me later on that we were the ones that finished Asir, then we let the army come in to take pictures. Now, that's not the case. The army were fighting there. But I don't think they were fighting together. This was Hezbollah doing its own thing. They had been monitoring Asir very clearly. And Abra is on the edge of the Shia area, Harat Saida. And they saw Asir as a local threat anyway. So when the balloon went up, they joined in.
Which in a way highlights the kind of elephant in the room, if you want, that has been plaguing Lebanon for 20 years, is that Hezbollah, by and large, is a state within a state and has a free hand and operates where it wants, when it wants, against whom it wants to. How is that going to end?
I don't know. I mean, this goes back to what I was saying earlier on, that this is the paradox Hezbollah faces, juggling the obedience to Iran and the obligations to its domestic constituency. You know, at the end of the day, the Shia, like all other Lebanese, they want to educate their kids, grow their tobacco and olives in the south, whatever, grow their hashish in the Becca, and live a quiet, peaceful life. They're no different from anybody else, and Hezbollah knows that, and they have to respect that. But you know, the way the country is going at the moment, it's going to get messy. I think it's going to get a bit messy.
I'd like to throw it open to the floor. It's quite a small floor today. I'm assuming everyone is now watching it on Facebook. Any questions?
I have a question. Bringing it back, do you hear me?
I do, Norbert, yes.
Yeah. Bring it back to wine again. There's all these rumors and stuff that all the cash is being sent to Syria, petrol's being sent to Syria right now. And wine producers, I was just in Iraq speaking with Elias Malouf, who produces it. Nobody can get, even places, things like Casada, they can't get bottles now. They can't get a hold of foreign cash to buy foreign, what is it called?
Raw materials.
Raw materials for the production of for wine. And it's I mean, for example, Qasar has 1 year supply. Some of the smaller ones, we had Mahar on a few weeks ago, and he's actually having people bring bottles back because he needs to use the bottles again. How are they thinking that all this, you know, with this conflict going, with Hezbollah also supporting this kind of this exodus of money going to Syria to prop up the Bashar regime? How is this going to affect the long-term wine producers here in Lebanon?
Well, that's probably a question for Mike rather than myself. But I mean, this is obviously this is one of the things people are focusing on at the moment, is the fact that we have a relatively porous border, and a lot of the government subsidized goods like diesel fuel and flour are heading across the border. And I think, you know, the videos are all over social media, seeing rows of trucks crossing the mountain, cutting through the mountains, heading off to Syria, and they're making big profits. It was interesting to see last week when we had 2-3 days of the lira collapsing from around 4,000 to the dollar to 5,300, maybe 6,000, rumors of 7,000, though I'm not sure that was true. So the idea, of course, is that if you're holding on to dollars, you take advantage of that sudden drop to go and fill your pockets with lira. And the effect of that is that somebody then has control over a lot more of the dollars. And it may not be a coincidence that the Syrian pound, which has been tumbling this year and accelerating, when this phenomenon happened last week with the Lebanese lira plummeting against the dollar, suddenly the Syrian pound began rising against the dollar. So, you can do the math. And I haven't seen any hard evidence that large amounts of cash were going across the border. There's some pictures on social media of pallets stacked with bundles of $100 bills, all tightly cellophaned, with someone putting a date, the contemporary date, saying this is the Lebanese US dollars that have come across to Syria. Ha ha ha! We've got it, you haven't. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But it was interesting to see the fluctuation and the tumbling Lebanese lira and the rising Syrian pound at the same time. What effect that will have, Norbert, on the wine producers is probably much the same as on every other industry in Lebanon. It's going to have a negative impact.
I can tell you, Norbert, that some of the major producers with a strong international presence before the pandemic and the lockdown took effect, their strategy was to export, to generate as much hard currency as they could. And in many cases, keep the money out of the country, because once it's in the country, it can't go out again. And then use that money to buy the raw materials that you were talking about. But now, Lebanon has been hit by the double whammy, or should I say, double whammy of the political crisis, revolution, financial meltdown with the global pandemic. So it's not looking good.
I have a question for Nicholas. Good evening from Belgium, Nicholas. You were referring earlier to the friendly relationships with Saudi Arabia. That was something that intrigued me when I was there. How would you describe the impact of Saudi Arabia on Lebanon?
Well, the Saudis have had traditionally a strong influence in Lebanon, backing various Sunni leaders, prime ministers, and so on. In the old days, we're talking about the 60s and 70s, they didn't back necessarily one particular Sunni figure. They would spread their largesse amongst them. But that changed in the early 90s when Rafik Hariri, who was very much a protege of the Saudis, became prime minister. And the Saudis threw their full weight behind him and were very supportive of his, the big ambitious reconstruction program he launched to try to rebuild Lebanon after the civil war. I think that really continued until King Salman, obviously Hariri was killed in 2005, and his son Saad inherited his political mantle. But the Saudi support was still there, particularly during, I don't know how familiar you are with Lebanese politics, but we had a decade of very bitter rivalry between two parliamentary blocs, one led by Hezbollah, the other one which was mainly led by Hariri's people, Saad Hariri's people. But I think things have changed since 2015 when King Salman took over the throne, and his son Mohammed bin Salman is seen very much as the force in Saudi Arabia. And I think there was a sense of, particularly when Michel Aoun was elected president in November 2016, and this was after, 2.5 years or a year and a half stalemate, whilst Hezbollah and its allies ground down the will of the other political leaders who opposed Aoun becoming president. And finally, of course, it was Saad Hariri saying, okay, I give up. We can't continue this stagnation any longer. I will vote for him. And the quid pro quo was that he came back as prime minister. That displeased the Saudis greatly. You may recall a year later, with the arrests of Saudi businessmen and princes, Saad Hariri was summoned to Riyadh, incarcerated for a bit, and the French and the Americans had to step in to get him released. And that really signaled that I think the Saudis, for now, it can always change, the Saudis have kind of washed their hands of Lebanon. I think they see Lebanon pretty much as a lost cause. The Iranians have got Lebanon, Hezbollah's got Lebanon, and there's not a great deal of point pushing back. Now we see increasingly Turkish influence coming into Lebanon, particularly in the north, and Tripoli. It's still quite subdued at the moment, but it is there, which is an interesting dynamic given Turkey's involvement in northern Syria as well. But we'll see. I mean, things always change. As I say, the Saudis have been a heavyweight influence in Lebanon traditionally, and they may well be again sooner or later.
Okay, thanks. Interesting.
Sure.
Nick, I'd like to just end this fascinating discussion with a question that's always intrigued me, and probably one of the first chances I've had to ask it to you. What is it that you, a man from Kent originally, who grew up in England and came here in your mid to late 20s, what is it, the thing about Lebanon that has, what is it Lebanon's taught you, I think, or what have you learned from Lebanon?
Well, I'll tell you what attracted me initially was the joie de vivre of the Lebanese, the chaos of early 90s Lebanon. For someone who grew up in rather straight-laced England, that was refreshing. I liked that I could drive down a one-way road the wrong way. I liked Lebanon for the reasons that many Lebanese just want to get the hell out of Lebanon and go to a more ordered society in the West. After a while, of course, one gets married, you buy a property, you get sucked into the system, and then the chaos is not quite such fun. But I don't know, what has Lebanon taught me? I am forever learning. It is the longer you stay in Lebanon, the less you realize you know. It's a bottomless pit. What I love about Lebanon is its size, partly, that you can zip around from, I know every back road from Ramesh in South Lebanon to Wadi Khalid in the north, from Beirut to Asel, and it's such fun driving around. The hospitality of Lebanese, wherever you go, Howlo, into somebody's house for tea, coffee, whatever, that's really nice. And I love the topography of the country. So I'm an outdoors person. I go hiking up the mountains. And when you're sort of stuck in Beirut and it's summer like now and it's hot and it's humid and it's smelly and crowded, and 45 minutes you can be way up in the mountains in the middle of nowhere, and stunningly beautiful and still very unspoiled up in the Jurid, way up in Jabal Sanin, all the way up to Qanat al-Sadr and so on. And of course the politics is endlessly fascinating, endlessly frustrating as well. But it's such an exciting place to live. And even now, where things are very gloomy, it's still extremely exciting. I mean, I don't know, you feel alive in a country like this. There's never a dull moment. And it's also the stoicism of the Lebanese, particularly the Lebanese of the South. I really got to respect them during the 90s. And their sense of humor and stoicism and putting up with decades of crap, war and occupation and conflict. In the same way that the Lebanese, they know how to enjoy themselves. If you remember in 2005, 2006, when the country was being rocked by assassinations and arbitrary bombings, and it would have a dampening effect for about 24 hours, and people would stay at home. 48 hours later, everyone's back in the pubs and the bars and the clubs and going out and enjoying themselves. So it is a cliche, but it's a resilience of the Lebanese is very, very admirable.
Well, that's one of the kind of cornerstones of the film, is the resilience of the Lebanese entrepreneur. And just finally, what Lebanese wine are you drinking now, these days?
Do you know, I drink all of them. I knew you were going to ask me this question. I don't have a firm favorite. And I'm even reluctant to name names because there are going to be people saying, well, what about my one? You've come to my winery plenty of times. It's one of the first articles I wrote in Lebanon was on wine. And this would have been early 95, I think. And I went to see the big three then, Chateau Kafraya, Ksara, Chateau. What has been fascinating to my mind, as someone that dabbled, albeit briefly, in the wine trade in London many, many moons ago, is the explosion of wineries that we've seen over the last 25 years. And I think Lebanese wine is becoming more and more exciting. I'll admit that I did get a little tired of Lebanese reds a few years ago. I felt too many of them were over-oaked. There wasn't enough light, refreshing reds that you could quaff with supper. That's changing. There's a lot more lighter and more interesting blends coming out. And I think Lebanese whites has been a revelation over the last decade or so. Very interesting stuff emerging. And, you know, let's keep it up. Let's keep going. Regardless of what happens in the country, let's keep making wine.
Good. Nick, thank you. I know it's now coming to 8 o'clock where you are, and you're probably hungry. You want to go and have a drink and sit with your families. So I'm going to say on behalf of Mark and all the regulars who are here, Norbert and Bart and Philippa Mishlawi who had to leave, and even our friend Madeline from London is plugged in today. And to all the people on Facebook who tuned in, thank you. And I hope that we've added a new dimension to the film's thesis statement, and just probably added another layer of understanding to your knowledge of the Middle East. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it immensely.
Thank you, Nick.
Bye-bye.